SEP Fanfic Readings presents What the Room Requires by Alydia Rackham. Chapter 15, Day 22. Hermione. I have never been interested in Quidditch, I said as I held a piece of the poor kite tail over my head, letting the wind catch it as we walked. First year, I couldn't even get the broom to come up to me when I said up. Draco laughed. Yeah, I remember that. It made no sense, I declared. The magic word was up, so why didn't it come? Because the broom knew you didn't really mean it, Draco said. I glanced at him, striding beside me in the morning light, strands of hair being blown into his crystal eyes. He smirked at me. I narrowed my eyes and lowered the kite. Of course I meant it, I retorted. That was the assignment, to get the broom to come to your hand. No, the broom knew you didn't actually want to fly, Draco said, leaning his head back, letting the sun beam down on his face, so it wouldn't come. Didn't want to get its hopes up. The broom knew, I spat. Get its hopes up? Rubbish! It's a broom! Draco laughed out loud. I kicked a few stalks, irritated. So if you're not interested in Quidditch, why do I see you in the stands? He asked. Everybody goes to matches, I answered. He glanced at me and raised his eyebrow. And the tryouts? I felt my cheeks heat up. I was being supportive, I said. Harry was the new Gryffindor Quidditch captain. You went to watch him sit on his broom? Draco questioned. Yes, I cried, my cheeks getting even hotter. Sounds incredibly interesting, Draco commented flatly. Must not have had enough homework to do. Ronald was also trying out that day, I quipped. Draco frowned at me. Ronald? He said, confused. Then his brow cleared. Oh, you mean Beanpole Weaselby. What? Don't call him that, I snapped. That isn't nice. I don't care. I stared at him. His countenance has blackened, adopting a malice I hadn't seen in a long time. What's the matter with you? I asked. His eyebrow twitched, and he didn't look at me. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, I insisted. Why are you so nasty all of a sudden? I met my eyes directly, cold. Look, it can't be a secret that I don't like your friends, he said. Why would that change? Because they're not really as horrible as you seem to think, I said, increasing my speed as I walked, trying to come up with a way to convince him. Harry is a loyal friend, and he has your back in an instant should you ever need him. And Ronald is funny and happy and a brilliant Quidditch player. Oh, he is not, Draco rolled his eyes. And he's a fine friend, I pressed on, my voice rising. Honest, easy to get along with, easy to have fun with, and I love his company. Draco staring at me now, his brow furrowed, his eyes keen. I stopped suddenly, realizing that I'd spent a lot more time describing Ron than Harry. What? I asked, though I knew what I was blushing hard. Draco looked at me like I was transparent, then stepped closer to me. I started to sweat. His eyebrows twitched again. You fancy him. My eyes flashed. What? No, I don't. His gaze caught fire. You're going to lie to me. Really? His expression closed and he leaned back. Good to know. I've been honest with you about everything you've asked me while we've been stuck in this godforsaken pit, and you're going to lie to me about whether or not you want to marry the ginger beanpole. He turned and walked away from me. Marry? What? What? I roared, storming after him. Who said anything about marrying him? You don't have to, he shot back, not turning. What does that mean? I demanded, racing up beside him. I'm not blind, Granger, nor am I deaf, he growled, still walking. You just turned 3 shades of red. Your face gave away just as much as your lying did. I'm not lying, I insisted, enraged. I care for Ron, yes, but just as much as I care for Harry. I watched that tryout. Cormac McLaggen should have been Gryffindor's keeper, Draco stated. He was more athletic ability in his little finger than Weaselby has in his whole body. That is not true, I shouted, losing control of my voice. And besides, Cormac is vile, loathsome. Don't call Ron that. You're positively batty, Granger, Draco spun around to face me. Listen to yourself. You've gone mad. I have not. Then stop lying to me, he gritted, leaning in close to my face. It's insulting. Tell me the truth. Tell me whether or not you like him, and stop treating me like I don't know what's going on here. I froze. My throat locked, and my heart hammered so hard I thought it would break my ribs. But Draco did not move, and his blue eyes pierced right through me. Yes, I breathed. Then I swallowed and looked away. Yes, I like him, all right. Draco didn't say anything. When I glanced back at him, he blinked, lifted his eyebrows in a dark indifference, and glanced down. Does he know? I shifted, then wrapped my arms around myself. Well, no, I don't think so. Draco met my eyes. I know you haven't got the nerve to come out and tell him anything, but if he hasn't noticed, he's more daft than I realized. I went pale. Am I that obvious? Draco raised an eyebrow. I felt like I was going to die. Draco sneered, all wickedness. Clearly, you two are meant for each other, Draco scoffed. Clearly. I just stood there, feeling like I was about to break underneath his heavy glare. Then, with a suddenness that made me gasp, he turned and started marching back toward the willow. What? Where are you going? I demanded. I've had enough of this walk and talk nonsense, he retorted, not turning back. I'm going to read. My chest went tight, my fists clenched. I almost broke the last remaining intact piece of wood on the kite. Why do you care whether or not I like Ron? I shouted. Draco stopped, faced me, and spread his hands to the sides. I don't. Then he turned back around and headed to the tree. Something twisted inside me, and all at once I felt like crying. I didn't, though. I swallowed tears, bit them back, whirled around, and sat down hard, my back to him and that stupid willow. I threw the kite down and ground my teeth. A tear leaked out. I dashed it away, then slapped a few stalks of barley. I drew my knees up to my chest, wrapped my arms around them, and set my chin on my knees. The wind sounded lonesome all of a sudden. I wrapped my arms tighter and closed my eyes. Hermione. I sat for a great deal of time out there, listening to the wind. Thinking about Ron and Harry had given me a sort of homesickness, and I felt heavy and tired. I also didn't like the fact that Draco and I had had a row. I know, completely backwards, I muttered to the room. The wind seemed to go quiet, as if a tall, invisible presence had leaned closer to listen. I swallowed. But it's still none of his business, I insisted, though I kept my voice down. I haven't even told my mother about Ron, and, well, not that there's anything to tell. That fact galled me, and I swallowed hard. I snapped off a stalk and twirled it between my fingers. The wind murmured comfortingly, brushing a strand of hair off my shoulder. I had felt uncontrolled when I'd been shouting at Draco, almost irrational. Draco had appeared cool as ice, and the irksome thing was that he was probably right. After all we'd discussed and fought through in this room, what was the point of lying about something as stupid as a crush? Well, my feelings were deeper than a crush, but if nothing had been declared, or admitted, rather, then it could only be technically classified as a crush if I were to discuss it. Wasn't it only natural, though, to get defensive when somebody shoves prying questions right into the deepest part of your heart, asking about a subject I never talk about? Yes, probably. But why had Draco been asking them? Maybe he had wanted to see my reaction. He was always gauging me, I knew that. Always feeling me out, trying to reckon how I tick. But it was his reaction that had seemed odd, now that I thought about it. Yes, he had seemed cool and calm on the outset, but I could swear that there had been at least 2 flashes of genuine anger in his eyes, and something else. Condescension? Resentment? I shook my head and lay back on the ground to stare up at the cloud-dotted sky. No, that wasn't it, but I couldn't tell what it was. He was too good at masking his real emotions, covering them up with a sneer and cruel look. Because that was all it was now, a mask, but it was still effective. This is ridiculous, I groaned. The barley seemed to chuckle. I gritted my teeth. Draco was just angry because I'd lied to him, to his face, and I was very bad at it. Especially when we'd almost begun to establish a strange, shaky trust. I was fouling it up, and that's what he resented. That's what it was. He'd said he didn't care whether or not I had a crush on Ron. He just didn't like Ron at all. Mentioning him and Harry was what had made him upset. And, well, fine, I shouldn't have lied. I heaved a sigh, then rubbed my face. How was I supposed to mend things now? Draco had stormed off to the willow to read, leaving me out here. I needed something to break the silence. Give me an opening to apologize. My brow furrowed as I thought. The field rustled and whispered. What had we been talking about just before all this mess? Quidditch. Draco had been telling me about the first snitch he'd caught during a match at Ravenclaw, second year. He laughed while telling the story and acted out exactly how it had happened, and how he'd stood in the middle of the pitch and shook it in his fist for the crowd. He said it had been one of the best moments of his life. The heaviness on my chest returned. I wished that I had something to remind him of that, to show him that I really had been listening to the story. I knew how great it had made Harry and Ron feel to talk about triumphs in sports. I wished I had a quaffle, or even a Quidditch banner. Or better yet, if I only had that snitch. A soft jingling sounded to my left. I twitched and turned over to face the noise. There, lying not 3 feet away, nestled in the grass, was a small golden ball. I stared at it for a long moment, then smiled. That invisible presence seemed to sway in satisfaction. I picked the snitch up. The wings did not expand. It sat lightly in my palm, glinting in the sunlight. I got to my feet and headed to the willow. Hermione. I hesitated just inches from the willow curtain, closed my fingers around the snitch, and took a deep breath. I bit my lip, then lifted my left hand and pushed the curtain out of the way and stepped inside. The little golden sparks leaped up around my feet. My eyes found Draco reclining back against the root by the grandfather clock, holding the complete Sherlock Holmes open in both hands. He didn't look up. I swallowed, then cleared my throat. Hi. His icy eyes flicked up to mine, then he turned his attention back to the pages. Hello? I drew myself up. Are you still angry with me? Why would I be angry? He muttered. I don't know, I shrugged, trying to keep my nerves back. I mean, you seemed angry, and I know I was, but I'm not anymore. He didn't say anything. I took a few steps closer. Then I held up the snitch. I found this in the grass. His head came up. The soft light gleamed off the smooth surface of the snitch. He studied it for a moment, his brow slowly furrowing. I lowered the little ball, then tossed it underhanded to him. It rang softly as it passed through the air. Draco lifted his right hand. The snitch slapped slightly into his palm. And the next instant, the wings unfurled from its sides and began fluttering within its grasp. He blinked. His gaze found me, suddenly softer. I'm sorry, I confessed into the opening, letting out a sigh. You've been nothing if not honest with me, always, and it was stupid of me to lie to you. I took another breath, bracing myself and forcing myself to go on. I do like Ron, quite a lot. I have for a while now. A crooked smile forced his way into my lips. Unfortunately, I believe that he's only just realized I'm a girl. That doesn't surprise me. Draco rolled his eyes, letting go of his snitch. It hovered just above his head. He watched it, eyes narrowed. So, he said a bit louder, you've been holding your breath for Weasley all this time? I watched my feet in the little lights, and I took a couple steps nearer to my spot. I suppose. What about Potter? Draco asked. Is he disappointed? My head jerked up, and I stared at him. He just waited, watching me, eyebrows raised. Disappointed? I repeated. Harry? Yeah, I thought you two had a thing, he said, turning back to intently studying the snitch. Well, there were 1 or 2 times where I thought I started, then shook my head, but no, I'm fairly certain he has a huge crush on Ginny. Gah! Draco huffed, batting at the snitch. He missed. What is it with these Weasleys? They're good company, I explained. They're welcome and congenial. They live in a barn. My eyes narrowed. It's a big house. He arched an eyebrow at me. You can really see yourself having a dozen red-headed children, cooking, cleaning, knitting the rest of your life, giving your kids hand-me-downs, clothes, books, and toys? He asked. Hardly ever being able to travel or rest or see or do fantastic things? There's no shame in being poor, I snapped back. He shrugged and turned back to his snitch. I didn't say there was. It just doesn't seem to suit you. Irritation built within me. I tightened my hands and calculated my words before I spoke. I happen to like the idea of a simple life. Yes, he scoffed, the idea. My face flushed again, and this time I couldn't bite back my reply. What on earth makes you an authority on what I want, Malfoy? You have no idea. You want somebody with class, Hermione. He cut in, looking at me directly as the snitch whizzed behind my head. Someone who hasn't sat right across from you day after day, year after year, without realizing what is it he's seeing. He gestured carelessly, then directed his remarks to the willow curtain. Somebody who's a gentleman, who's your equal, for heaven's sake, or at least close to it. He shook his head. You don't want a man who merely dawdles around while you pine away into dust, wishing he would get hit upside the head and actually look at you for once. He met my eyes. You want a man who knows what he wants and goes after it, and never leaves you doubting his feelings. Anything else is ridiculous and a waste of your time. He got up and stepped toward the willow curtain. Why wasn't I breathing? I'm going for a walk, he said, not looking back. Thanks for the snitch. And he left, the snitch buzzing out behind him. Draco. This was irritating. No, she was irritating. It was impossible for me to be in her presence right now. I couldn't take it. Even the sound of her talking was driving me mad. I swept through the barley field, leaving the willow behind. I listened for a long time, then allowed myself to relax when I didn't hear any following footsteps, just the soft breeze and a little snitch. What an odd thing for her to come up with, that snitch. Why had she been thinking of it? And why had the room decided to give it to her? It had to mean something. I shook my head, berating myself. This place was truly chipping away at my reason. Sometimes I completely forgot I was in a room at Hogwarts and fancied myself to truly be in a sunny field with Hermione Granger. Moments of that had been tolerable, even pleasant, but now I didn't like it here anymore. I don't especially like the idea of trying to get out of here, either. I muttered darkly to myself, ramming my hands in my pockets. I knew what waited for me out there. Real blood, real pain, real wounds, real murder. But in here, I batted the snitch with the back of my hand. It had buzzed too close to my left ear. I scowled. It was absolutely absurd that Hermione's affection for Weasley had ruffled me. Even as I walked, trying to think about that conversation, I couldn't understand my reaction. Why had I even led the topic that direction? Had I been trying to trap her in a lie? Or had I been hoping that she would disprove my suspicions? What? What suspicions? Why would I have any suspicions? No, I had just been angry that she looked at me in the eye and lied to me. About that. How stupid was she anyway? Did she really think she could get away with deceiving me? She's not stupid, I mumbled, kicking at the grass. And really, had she been lying, or just deciding how and when to tell the truth? After all, it hadn't taken her long to come up to the willow and admit as much after she cooled down. So why had her second admittance made me feel worse instead of better? I snapped a barley head off and began picking at it as I increased my pace. What I'd felt when she'd told me was still fresh. It had been a cold sensation, cold and heavy and slick, like an icy snake sliding down my throat and into my gut, tightening my chest as he went, and settling in some sort of nausea. I still felt it a little bit, even as the snitch swung back and forth behind my head, humming as if trying to distract me. But this was too bewildering, too baffling for me to be distracted. I had to puzzle it out. I had felt the sensation before, actually quite often. There were some days when it just lived inside me, turning into a regular goblin with my classmates. It wasn't the sensation that confused me right now. It was the situation in which I felt it. Usually, that stabbing, cold, clenching, sliding, panging feeling attacked me when Potter was involved. Whether it be seeing his face on the front page of the Daily Prophet, or watching him concoct the best living death potion Slughorn had ever seen, or watching him compete as the youngest wizard ever in the Triwizard Tournament, or seeing a cloud or a pretty girl's flutter and giggle when he passed, because they caught a glimpse of his famous scar. It came at its worst whenever Potter stood in the middle of the Quidditch pitch, holding the prize golden snitch over his head and shaking it like he'd just won the World Cup. This just felt as bad. But it wasn't just Potter who evoked that feeling now. It was Weasley. And it wasn't the snitch. It was... The snitch buzzed around in front of my face, making me jerk back before it spun around my head once more and drifted happily on my shoulder. I frowned at it. It just glinted in reply. I decided to ignore the stupid thing and keep walking. I was so sick of feeling sick because of Potter and Weasley. And right at that moment, the idea that Weasley was making me sick, for whatever reason, I wasn't going to go there, was just intolerable. Why on earth would anything he did or had make me furious? He was daft, ugly slug, and Potter was a stuck-up attention pig, and neither of them had any clue about Hermione. How was that possible? How could she shower affection and attention and kindness on them year after year, and yet both of them go after other girls? Lavender Brown? I wanted to vomit. And Ginny Weasley? She was bright enough, but not brighter than Hermione, and no great beauty in comparison. Weasley and Potter were mad. It was actually Hermione that had done the natural thing. After spending years with the two of them and probably enduring quite a lot of difficult situations, she had probably fallen for Potter first. But when he took notice of Cho Chang, or whoever else that smiled at him, she probably gave up. And then she turned to Weasley, only to have him be even more brick-headed about it than Potter. What? Did they think girls like Hermione just grew on trees? I stopped walking and glanced back. The willow stood on the horizon. The west wind blew through my hair. I sighed, resigned, and sat down. The snitch bumbled about somewhere above me and behind me. I propped my elbows on my knees and glared at the ground. So what was it that I wanted? For a long while I sat very still, breathing evenly. I closed my eyes and let my thoughts drift open, as I tried to force my ancient barriers out of the way so I could actually see myself. Honestly, I wanted to stop living in Potter and Weasley's shadow. I wanted to quit trying to live up to their image, their fame, their popularity. I wanted to stop measuring my character against theirs. I wanted to feel strong and worthy on my own, completely apart from anything they did or said. I wanted to do something that they could have done, but didn't. I wanted to, not to snub them, but because it was right. Because I saw something they had missed, and the very fact that I had seen it and they hadn't made me different than them. It gave me strength, and the ability was not greater, but different. Different as a forest fire and an avalanche. My own power. Power to do something good, something lasting. I wanted to fix what Potter had broken. I wanted to claim what Weasley had ignored. I wanted Hermione. I opened my eyes. The little snitch buzzed in front of my face. It had been there the whole time during this internal battle, following me, humming happily, and I had swatted it away. Still, it had faithfully followed, and now it hovered right there, tilting one way, then the other, like a cheerful waiting bird about a foot out of reach. I suddenly felt out of breath, and my heart hammered. Slowly, I reached out my right hand, palm up. The snitch darted back. I stopped. It inched a little closer. I extended my arm all the way. The snitch froze where it was, only its wings moving. Then it drifted toward me, and as I held my breath, it settled right into the hollow of my hand, and it unfurled its wings like it had come to nest. I felt a warmth against my skin. I closed my fingers and wound it gently before I got to my feet. A balmy wind greeted me, blowing through my shirt and hair. I took a breath. I faced the willow. I took a step toward it, then another. Then, my jaw tightening, I walked with lengthening strides back toward it and her. Day 23. Hermione. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Good, Draco declared, stepping back, lowering his sword and dashing his hair out of his face with his hand. I hefted my own blade, grinned. That was rather good, I cried. He answered with a grin. It was, but it's only because I'm such a fantastic tutor. You know that, right? Oh, of course, I rolled my eyes, laughing. Let me know when you're ready to learn a few things. Oh, Draco gave me a mock-impressed look. You think you have this sorted already? I know I do, I replied cockily. You were the one who said I'm a fast learner. All right then, Granger, let's see what you have. He set his stance, raised his blade, and I lunged at him. We did not follow the pattern, though. A few sequences fell into place without planning. Our blades clacked and snapped against each other, and I found myself backpedaling. He was so much better than I was. Still, I was managing to hold my own, until he feigned one way and then jabbed another. I jerked back and flailed. My blade connected with his right hand. Crack! Ah! He leapt back, grimaced, and dropped his sword, then shook out his hand. Oh! I cried, dropping my own sword and hurrying up to him. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. No, it's my fault, he gritted, clutching his hurt hand to his left. I shouldn't have pressed you. Let me see it. I'm fine. Don't be such a boy. Let me see it. Hermione. I reached out to pry off his left hand, but he backed away and just held out his right hand so I could see but not touch. Look, it's nothing, he started, but I'd already gasped and put my hand over my mouth. The knuckle of his forefinger was red, and there was a deep purple spot where I'd broken a blood vessel. That isn't nothing, I protest. I really hurt you. I've had worse, all right, he glared at me. Stop making such a fuss. I felt sheepish and ashamed, but he was in pain, and he probably angry at me. I needed to think of something. Do you want me to make it feel better? I asked. He eyed me. What are you going to do? I canted my head, trying to be a little light and playful. What any muggle or muggle-born who knows anything would do. Give me your hand. I held out my own. He hesitated, glanced up at me, then stretched out his hand to me. It shook a little, out of the shock of being injured. I took it up swiftly and pressed my lips right to the hurt spot. Draco sucked in his breath. My heart thudded unreasonably. My eyes flew to his. He stared at me, his cheeks flushed. And then he looked at his hand. I followed his gaze, and the redness had disappeared, and the deep purple bruise faded, and the pale, long-fingered hand I had in both of mine looked as normal as it ever had. That's new, he remarked. I swallowed hard. Slowly he drew his hand out of mine and bent to pick up his sword. He straightened and cocked his head. Does it work that way in Muggle-land? I stammered. He grinned at me, then strode toward the willow. I'm going to straighten the mess you made when you threw all the drawlings all over the floor. I blinked and started after him. I wasn't making a mess, I was organizing. Same thing. Why do you have to argue with everything I say? I don't. Draco Malfoy, I berated him. But all he did was laugh. Hermione. It is rather a mess in here, I admitted, glancing around the Willow Room at all of our accumulated belongings. Altogether, there were 2 pillows, a blanket, 3 melted ice packs, a daffodil, which hadn't changed at all since I picked it, Pride and Prejudice, the complete Sherlock Holmes, a chessboard and all its bits, a 500-piece puzzle, a broken kite, 2 boxes of colored pencils, half of which were snapped in half, piles of used drawing paper, 2 wooden swords, a snitch, and a grandfather clock. Looking at all of it, I felt a sinking sensation like a stone settling in the bottom of a stream. How long had we been here? It looked as if we lived in this willow. For there was Draco's corner, by the clock. He had his white pillow tucked into a nook between 2 roots, and the 2 books he had claimed as his own sat stacked neatly beside it along with the box of pencils. His sword leaned against the other root. He had just now stuffed the useless ice packs inside the pendulum chamber of the useless clock, and now it was busily tying the remains of the kite up to the willow curtain as a type of banner, while the snitch buzzed happily around him. Between our living area, like a divider, sat the chessboard, neatly arranged, black on his side, white on mine. Next to the board sat the puzzle box. My side of the room contained the Slytherin pillow and the blanket, folded lengthwise like a sleeping bag. The daffodil leaning up against a root, next to my nearly empty drawing pad and pencils. My sword lay beside my bed. What made the place look like a mess were at least 24 pencil drawings that laid strewn all over the place like carpet grass. Covering the little white flowers and smothering the golden lights, I sat on the ground, cross-legged, and considered the pictures. I don't want to shove them back in the books, I mused, but I don't want to toss them. What? Where were you going to toss them? Draco asked, making another knot in the string that held the kite's tail to the branches. I shrugged. Out. He snorted. Out. I frowned, at a loss. Draco turned around and put his hands on his hips. He glanced at me, then at the mess. You know what you need? He said. Thumbtacks. Huh? I looked at him. He nodded. You need thumbtacks. An entire box of them. That way you could pin the pictures up on the trunk of the tree. Or you could still see them and not be underfoot. Clunk. Ow! Draco's hand flew to his head as something small and square bounced off his skull. It thudded to the ground. I shot to my feet. Still rubbing his hair, he bent down and picked it up. It was a little tin. He shook it. It rattled. He pried open the lid and smirked. What is it? I asked. His smirk widened and he stepped closer and handed me the box. Thumbtacks, he exulted. I grinned. You're a genius. Oh, you don't have to tell me that. Shut up, I chuckled, then bent and picked up the picture of Draco's dragon. Hermione. Do you ever wonder about the magic rules in this place? Draco asked me as I pinned up the last picture, my daffodil, on the tree over my bed. I folded my arms as I cast my gaze over the veritable mural now decorating the tree. I don't know, I muttered, narrowing my eyes. I always found that it got me into trouble. Draco chuckled, then came up beside me and straightened one of his pictures. Quite a lovely drawing of Hogwarts from the grounds. I don't mean about getting out. I mean about when you think of something, then it appears. I glanced at him. What do you mean? Well, there seems to be a pattern here, he said, casting his gaze over the pictures, then stepping over to his spot and sitting down. The snitch came to his hand, the wings closed, and he set the snitch in the grass. He looked up at me. You told me to go read, and then these shoot up out of the ground. He lifted the copy of Sherlock Holmes. But they're not something I would have picked out. You thought of them. My brow furrowed, and I turned to him. Yes? Then, well, come here. He motioned me closer, then patted the grass next to him. I want to know what you think of this. I hesitated, then stepped closer and sat down. He straightened, faced me, and crossed his legs, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He met my eyes, his gaze intensifying. We have things like the daffodil and the kite. I'll admit I did think of the flower for you, and I believe you thought of the kite for me. He pressed his hand to his chest and raised his eyebrows. Am I right? Yes, I believe so, I said, wondering where he was going with this. A smile broke through his intensity. Just a bit ago, I thought of thumbtacks for you, and they hit me in the head. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, he leaned a bit closer, as if to share a secret, that we could literally conjure anything if we thought about it clearly enough, but it only works if we wish it for the other person. That makes some sense, I admitted, nodding. But doesn't there have to be some element of need to it as well, for the room to respond? Draco shrugged. Well, need is relative. I certainly don't need books to survive, but they kept me from going mad. And you didn't need that flower. Yes, I did, I said, unable to keep from smiling. A surprised smile of his own cut off his words, and he laughed. All right, all right. But this place itself is a testament to what I'm talking about. Look at all of these things. Not once were any of my things conjured by me, and not once were any of your things conjured by you. Well, except the blanket and pillow, but I gave you those. Yes, apparently, I admitted. So, he said, flashing his eyebrows, grinning at me, use your imagination. Think of something for me. Huh, what? I cried. Go ahead, he urged. I'm interested in seeing what you come up with. I don't know, I struggled. I know one for you, he said. I can give it a try. I looked at him askance. What? You need a barrette for your hair, he said. It's always blowing in your face when we're sword fighting, and you complain that it's the reason you make mistakes. I do not. But it can't be just any barrette, he said thoughtfully, glancing off. I know you're bored with your school uniform. When did I tell you that? He met my eyes and snapped his fingers. I've got it. What? The next instant, something like a sparkling star tumbled from the sky and fell into my lap. I jerked back, gasping. There, pillowed against the black of my skirt, lay a beautiful, slender, diamond-studded hair clip, elegant with a silver floral motif. I picked it up. It felt so light and glimmered in the glow. Ha! I said breathlessly, turning it over in my fingers. It's lovely. A bit dressy for sword fighting, I suppose, but my grandmother has one very like it. My mother always admired it. I could see why, I breathed, realizing that if Grandma Malfoy owned it, it was probably genuine. I'd never held something so gorgeous and valuable. Go on, Draco urged. Well, I drew my fingers around one side of my hair, frowning, wishing I had a... This might help. Draco snatched something off the grass and held out a silver hand mirror. Now I blushed. I could see as much in the flashing reflection. Oh, now I feel spoiled, I murmured, taking it from him and holding it up. These things really are too... Then think of something for me, Draco suggested, laying over onto his elbow and giving me a smug, expectant look. I snorted, still half smiling, and slipped the barrette into my hair. I glanced at my reflection, studying the way the shimmering jewelry looked in my hair. Then I caught Draco staring at me. What? I asked, for his face had lost its humor. He blinked and cleared his throat. Nothing. I'm just waiting. I felt my eyebrow flick, for I didn't quite believe him, and I cradled my new mirror in my lap and tried to think. What does Draco Malfoy need? Something moved, or appeared, rather, behind him. It caught my eye. Draco noticed. He grinned. What? He asked and twisted around, to see an elegant brass standing lamp with a curved neck, much like one I'd seen in a castle study once. Draco sat up. Hey, this is brilliant, he said. In that moment, the lamp lit, spilling a soft but bright light down right on the spot he would need to read. Now I won't go blind trying to see with that blue light, Draco said, glancing far upward. We wouldn't want that, I grinned. He chuckled and turned to look at it again, and put his hand on a folded black fleece blanket. Startled and pleased, I giggled and slapped a hand over my mouth. Draco's wide eyes found mine, and he grabbed the blanket and unfolded it. It bore a great silver Slytherin crest. He barked out a laugh, his face brightening, and he immediately got up and spread the blanket out, sat down on it, wrapped it around his legs, and snatched up his copy of Sherlock Holmes. Utter perfection, Draco decided, leaning back and opening the book. I know what I want next. Oh, really? I said. He nodded once. I have read several pages of The Sign of the Four, he said, and I require a pipe and tobacco. You do not, I laughed. That's terribly bad for you. It is not. My grandfather smoked, and he lived to be 160, Draco retorted. Besides, you cannot read this without puffing on a pipe. Listen. He cleared his throat and lifted the book. He lifted one eyebrow, deepened his voice, and thickened his words with a stiff London accent, and held up his hand as if he were holding a curved pipe, and began to read. You will not apply my precept, he said, shaking his head. How often have I said to you that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth? We know that he did not come through the door, the window, or the chimney. We also know that he could not have been concealed in the room, as there is no concealment possible. Draco turned a piercing look on me. When, then, did he come? I was already laughing so hard I hardly heard the last part. Go on, I urged him, snatching my Slytherin pillow, wrapping my arms around it and setting my chin on the top. Really? He was startled. I nodded quickly. Yes, read. Well, I'd better start at the beginning then, or you'll have no idea what is going on, he said, glancing up at me a couple times to see if I really meant it. I gave him a smile. He chuckled, shook his head, then flipped back a few pages. He cleared his throat again. The Sign of 4, Chapter 1, The Science of Deduction, he read. Sherlock Holmes took his bottle from the corner of the mantelpiece, and his hypodermic needle syringe from its neat morocco case. Draco. Hermione lay not far from me, curled up with the pillow, half covered with her blanket, completely asleep. We'd finished the Sign of 4 and started on a scandal in Bohemia before she'd begun to doze. I think the last thing out of my mouth was actually, with tuppence for paper and strings, you can have your own set of wings, just to see if she was listening. But she hadn't been. She was sleeping. I adjusted my pillow and shut the book, setting it beside my snitch. I glanced down at Hermione again, letting my gaze linger on her face and the sparkling barrette in her hair, all softened by the magic blue light and the light from my lamp. I halfway smiled. I'd been right about the conjuring in this room. It had only been a theory of mine, but now that both of us had proved it, I knew that what I had in mind could, in fact, be done. Maybe. I still needed a few things before I could even begin to set my plan in motion, and for that, I would have to rely on a greater power. I reached up and switched off my lamp. Then I leaned back and gazed up at the sparkling depths of the top of the willow. I'm going to need a rather big favor, I whispered. Please. I didn't hear any reply, but in the wind outside seemed to laugh, very distantly, and the sound of it made me smile, and lay back on my pillow, and fall asleep before I knew it.